The day I told the truth I had kept for 45 years. I no longer expected forgiveness. I just needed to stop carrying that burden alone. My name is Helena. I am 71 years old, and throughout my life, I have been seen as the perfect woman, the faithful wife, the devoted mother, the one who never gave cause for distrust. People always said I was an example, that my marriage was solid, that my family was beautiful, that I had done everything the right way, and I let them believe it. Not because it was a lie, but because the truth was too heavy to be contained in simple words. For decades, I woke up, took care of the house, raised a son, walked alongside my husband, attended birthdays, celebrations, Sunday lunches. I smiled in photos. I advised other women. I listened to others' confessions, while hiding my own. No one ever imagined the weight I carried in my chest. No one ever suspected the sleepless nights, the moments when my heart raced for no apparent reason. The constant fear that a single sentence could dismantle everything we had built. Because it wasn't a small secret. It wasn't something trivial. It was a truth capable of changing stories, identities, memories. And even so, I remained silent. Not for days, not for years, but for a whole 45 years. I learned to live divided. One part of me is present, functional, and correct. And the other part is trapped in that moment of the past, repeating the same question. What if they find out someday? Time passed. My body aged. My hands grew slower. My memory began to fail me on small things. But it never failed me on this secret. He grew old with me. He sat beside me at the table. He slept in the same bed. He walked silently with me for almost half a century. Until the day I realized I couldn't take it anymore. That keeping it inside was consuming me from the inside. That I no longer had the strength to pretend everything was normal. And that's when I understood the silence had protected me for a long time. But now it was suffocating me. I didn't tell the truth expecting absolution. I told it because surviving in silence was no longer living. And that's exactly where this story begins. I got married very young. I had simple dreams, but full of hope. I believed that love was built daily, through patience and partnership. And when I met my husband, I thought life had finally found a peaceful direction. He was an honest man, hardworking, one of those who would come home tired, but still ask if everything was all right. He never raised his voice to me. He never belittled me. He always treated me with respect. We built our life little by little. A modest house, but full of plans. Furniture bought with hard work. Holidays celebrated without luxury, but with presence. I felt safe. For the first time in my life, safe. When I got pregnant, I thought I had achieved everything a woman could want at that time. I was happy. Scared, yes, but happy. The idea of starting a family gave me meaning. It made me wake up with a purpose. The birth of my son was a milestone. I held that baby in my arms and felt something I had never felt before. A mixture of absolute love and absolute fear. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of not being enough. Fear of losing him. It was during that period between my pregnancy and my son's first few months that something happened. Something I've never spoken aloud. Something that changed everything, even without anyone noticing. On the outside, my life went on. I was the same wife, the same devoted mother, the same present woman. But inside, I had split in two. Part of me lived day to day. The other part remained trapped in that moment of the past. In an instant when the ground disappeared beneath my feet and I had to choose between the impossible and the unthinkable, it wasn't a choice made calmly. It wasn't planned. It was panic. It was survival. It was the fear of losing everything at once. I wasn't a bad woman. I never was. But I also wasn't as strong as they would like to believe. I was vulnerable, scared, alone in a decision I couldn't share with anyone. After that, I continued living, but I began to live with excessive caution, with constant fear, with a silent guilt that made no sound, but never slept. Every time my husband smiled at our son, my chest tightened. Not for lack of love, there was never a lack of love, but because there was a hidden truth between us, walking invisibly through the house. I became more attentive, more controlled, more silent. I learned to measure my words, to hide my reactions, to smile when inside I just wanted to take a deep breath. For years, I thought time would heal everything. that life would go on and that secret would lose its power. But time doesn't erase what was never said. It just pushes it inside. And so, day after day, I became an expert at appearing normal, at not raising suspicions, at carrying alone something I couldn't share. It was there, during that period of my youth, that the silence that would accompany me throughout my life was born. The years passed as they do for everyone, one after the other, without asking permission. I woke up, took care of the house, prepared meals, helped with schoolwork, did laundry, folded sheets, celebrated birthdays, weathered minor illnesses and more serious scares. On the outside, my life seemed ordinary. So ordinary that many people said I was an example. I became the present wife, the attentive mother, the proper woman who never aroused suspicion, never failed in commitments, never created conflicts, never gave cause for difficult questions. The secret forced me to learn one thing: normalcy can be trained. I knew exactly how to act, when to smile, when to remain silent, when to walk away before the subject got too close. The nights were harder. My husband slept beside me, breathing peacefully, while I lay awake staring at the ceiling. It wasn't regret in the simple sense of the word. It was vigilance. It was fear that something might slip out unintentionally. It was the exhaustion of carrying something alone for so long. During the day, I functioned. At night, I overthought. My son grew up surrounded by care, perhaps too much care. I observed every detail, every change in behavior, every innocent question. Anything different made my heart race. When someone would comment, "He takes after his father, doesn't he?" I smiled, a practiced smile, and I said, "Yes, he did." Inside, something was tightening. It wasn't my son's fault. It never was. He was the only pure thing in that whole story. As time passed, the secret ceased to be an isolated event and became part of my identity. I was no longer just a woman with a hidden story. I was a woman shaped by it. I learned not to talk too much. I learned not to create deep intimacies. I learned to keep everything in very well-closed compartments. People said I was reserved, discreet, strong. They never suspected that that strength was actually just tiredness. My body started giving me signals before my mind did. Pains that appeared without explanation. Sleepless nights. A silent anxiety that I couldn't name. But I kept going. I always kept going. Little by little, old age began to approach. Not suddenly, but like everything in life, gradually. First the mirror, then the breath, then the fear that time was running out. That's when something changed inside me. I started thinking about the end, not in a tragic way, but realistically, about the idea that life isn't infinite, that I might not have another 40 years ahead of me to endure that silence. The secret didn't age with me. It remained intact, heavy, current. While my body grew weary, the truth continued to demand space. I realized I was living each day like someone holding their breath, and that nobody can do that forever. It was during this period that small events began to weigh on me internally. Conversations about inheritance, questions about the past, casual comments that, before, I had been able to ignore. I started to feel something new. Urgency. It wasn't a desire to escape guilt. It was a fear of dying without returning the truth to those who deserved it. Time had passed, but the silence was becoming unbearable. The day that forced me to face the truth didn't arrive screaming. It arrived disguised as normality. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those when the house seems too quiet. My husband was sitting at the table, organizing old papers, documents, photos, mementos of a lifetime built together. I was at the stove, stirring a pot without paying attention to what I was doing. Then he spoke, in a calm, almost casual voice. "We need to organize everything properly. Nobody knows what tomorrow will bring." The phrase hit me like a slow punch. Not intentionally, he wasn't saying it out of fear, but because, at that moment, something inside me understood that time was cornering me. He pulled out a folder, opened it, and spread photos across the table. Old photos. Of our wedding. Of our young son. Of birthdays, graduations, simple trips. I saw those images on the wall every day. But there, scattered on the table, they seemed to silently accuse me. "Our son has always been our greatest joy," he said, smiling as he held up an old photograph. "I'm so proud of the man he's become. That's when my body reacted before I could. My hands started to tremble. My heart raced without warning. I felt short of breath. It wasn't the first time he'd said that, but it was the first time I'd asked myself, with genuine fear, what if I die before I can tell you? At that moment, my son joined the conversation without realizing what he was provoking. Dad, have you thought about getting a more thorough health checkup? He asked. These days there are tests for everything. I felt the ground slip from under my feet. The word exam. He opened a door that I had kept locked for 45 years. Not because anyone was suspicious, but because the truth had always been there, waiting for an opening. My husband laughed, nonchalantly. Why bother now? Everything's fine. But I wasn't feeling well. In my head, images began to blend together. Not the photos from the table, but the images I'd spent my whole life avoiding revisiting. I unintentionally returned to that distant day. I was still young, scared, alone in a way that no one else could see. I remembered the fear, the panic of losing everything at once, the pressure that came from all sides, the feeling of having no real choice, only survival. It wasn't a simple mistake. It wasn't a frivolous decision. It was a choice made with my back against the wall and my heart in ruins. Back then, I told myself I would tell the truth later, when everything was safe, when there was less risk, when the love was strong enough to endure. But later turned into years. Years turned into decades. And the truth became a burden I learned to carry in silence. Looking back at that afternoon, I realized I was no longer young, that my body no longer had the same resilience. That time, the same time that had protected me for so long, now threatened me. My husband kept talking, oblivious to everything. Whatever it is, we'll solve it together, he said, closing the folder. We always do. That tore me apart inside, because I knew there was something we never resolved together, something I resolved on my own, and hid from him. I went to my room earlier than usual that night. I said I was tired. It wasn't a lie. I was exhausted from pretending. I lay in bed staring into the darkness, my chest heavy. I couldn't sleep. For the first time in many years, I considered the real possibility of dying without saying anything. And that idea scared me more than losing everything. I understood then and there that the silence that had protected me for so long had become a prison. That the secret was no longer just a part of the past, it was stealing my present. It was no longer about what I would lose by telling. It was about what I was losing by remaining silent. That night, for the first time, I cried not from guilt, but from exhaustion. And it was there, alone in the dark, that I understood something I had avoided for decades. The silence was no longer keeping me alive. It was slowly killing me. I didn't know yet. Estelle, not even when no one would have the courage to do so. But I knew, with a clarity I'd never had before, I couldn't carry that much longer. The truth had taken root too deeply. And now, it needed air. After that night, nothing was ever the same again, even though, from the outside, everything seemed the same. I woke up early, made coffee, folded the laundry, watered the plants. I did everything automatically, as I had for years. But inside, something had given way. It was as if the secret, which had always remained quiet in a dark corner of my chest, had awakened. It didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It was just there, too heavy to ignore. I spent the whole day wondering if I had the right to tell, and at the same time, if I had the right to remain silent. Because it wasn't just my life that was at stake. It never was. I was thinking about my husband, the man who built an entire life by my side, believing in an incomplete truth. His honest gaze, the silent dignity with which he always faced everything. I was thinking about my son, about the love that existed between them, about their mutual pride, about the story I could shatter with a single sentence. And then I thought about myself, about the woman I gradually erased to maintain that lie, about the guilt that never fully slept, about the nights I woke up in a cold sweat, wondering what if they find out. For decades, I convinced myself that silence was an act of love, that hiding the truth was protecting, that telling it would be selfish. But for the first time, this logic began to fail, because I realized something I never wanted to admit. Silence was also a way of preserving myself, of avoiding confrontation, of avoiding rejection, of avoiding losing everything. It wasn't just altruism, it was fear. That afternoon, I sat alone in the living room and stared at an old photo on the shelf. My husband holding our young son. They were both smiling. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, not of regret for what I'd been through, but for the foundation on which it was all built. I lied. I whispered to myself, for the first time aloud. Saying that didn't relieve me. It devastated me. I cried like I hadn't cried in years. Not an explosive cry. It was a tired, deep cry. The cry of someone who had carried something too heavy for too long. That night, I barely managed to eat dinner. My husband noticed my unusual silence. "You seem strange today," he said carefully. "Did something happen?" I almost told. I swear I almost told. But fear still spoke loudly. Fear of destroying everything at the end of life. Fear that the truth would erase decades of love. Fear of hearing something I wasn't ready to hear. "It's just tiredness," I replied, once again, and that response hurt me more than any accusation. Because, at that moment, I understood that continuing to lie was costing me something essential: myself. I spent days in this conflict. I walked around the house like a visitor. I watched my husband and thought, he deserves to know. I watched my son and thought, perhaps it's too late. I knew that once the truth came out, nothing would ever be the same again. But I also knew that if it didn't, I would continue to fade away little by little. It was no longer about alleviating guilt. It was about restoring dignity. One night, lying in bed, I thought about something I had never thought about before. What if the love we've built is greater than the lie that sustained it? That question scared me, but at the same time, it gave me a strange courage. I didn't want to die carrying that burden. I didn't want my last big decision to be to remain silent. At that moment, even though I was scared, even without knowing the outcome, I understood. The downfall wasn't about telling the truth. The downfall was about continuing to live with it. And there, for the first time in 45 years, I made a silent decision. That would change everything. I was going to speak, even if it hurt, even if it cost something, even if there was no forgiveness. Because living without truth had already cost me too much time. I chose an ordinary night. No visitors, no noise, no witnesses. I waited for dinner to end, for the dishes to dry in the drainer, for the television to be turned off. I waited for the right silence that is not empty, but attentive. My husband sat in his usual armchair. I stood for a few seconds, holding my hands together, as if trying to stop my own body from trembling. "I need to talk to you," I said. He slowly raised his gaze. There was no irritation, no hurry, just attention. "Did something happen?" he asked. I sat down in front of him. I took a deep breath, so deep that it hurt in my chest. "What I'm about to tell you, I should have told you 45 years ago." He frowned, not out of distrust, out of confusion. "You're scaring me," he said quietly. I nodded, because I was too. The words lingered for a few seconds. Not because I didn't know what to say, I knew exactly what to say, but because each sentence was like pushing against a wall I had built myself. "I've carried a secret my whole life," I began. Not out of malice, not out of lack of love, but out of fear. He straightened up in the armchair. His body reacted before his mind. "What secret?" I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them, I decided not to go around anymore. "Our son," my voice faltered, but I continued, "is not biologically yours." The silence that followed was not immediate. It was slow, heavy. He blinked a few times, as if trying to understand the language I was speaking. "What's that?" he asked. There was no anger. There was disbelief. "I got pregnant at a time when everything was falling apart," I explained. "I was alone, scared, unsupported, without options. When I found out, you were already decided to stay with me, to build a life. And I couldn't tell you." He ran his hand over his face. He stood up. He took a few steps across the room. "Are you saying that?" His voice broke. "That I've lived my whole life believing in something that wasn't true?" I nodded. Tears were streaming down my face, but I didn't try to wipe them away. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid of losing you, afraid of destroying everything, afraid of not surviving the consequences." He stopped. He had his back to me for a few seconds that went on for far too long. "And for 45 years, he said slowly, "you thought this silence was the best thing?" "At first, yes," I replied. "Then it turned into cowardice. And later, it turned into imprisonment, He turned around. His eyes were watery but steady. "And our son?" he asked. "Does he know?" "No," I replied quickly. "I never knew. I never suspected I should know before you. This truth was my responsibility. And yours." He sat down again. His hand trembled slightly. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" he asked. "What does that change?" "I know it changes everything," I replied. "But I also know that keeping this hidden was killing me. And I didn't want to leave this life without giving you back the truth." He remained silent. A silence different from mine. A wounded silence. "Did you love me?" he asked suddenly. The question struck me. "I love you," I replied. "I always have. If I didn't love you, I would have left. If I didn't love you, I wouldn't have carried this burden alone." He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a moment. "You took away my right to choose," she said, with pain, not anger. I lowered my head. "I know. And that's something I'll carry with me until the end." He spent long minutes without saying anything. I didn't interrupt. I didn't apologize. I didn't ask for understanding. Because that night wasn't about easing my guilt. It was about taking responsibility for what I did. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he finally said. "It's not the blood. It's the time. It's realizing that something so big came between us without me knowing." I nodded. "Because it was true. I didn't tell you before because I was afraid of losing you," I said in a low voice. "I told you today because I couldn't bear losing you any longer." He looked at me. A tired look. Human. Without hatred. "I need time," he said. "I know," I replied. There were no shouts. There were no insults. There was no forgiveness at that moment. There were only two people sitting before a truth too great to contain in words. That night, we slept in the same room, but not in the same silence. And I knew then that the revelation wasn't the end of the pain, it was the beginning of a truth that, for the first time in decades, didn't weigh only on me. The days that followed were shapeless. They weren't good days, but they weren't days of lies either. There was silence, a silence different from the one that had accompanied me for 45 years. This new silence wasn't just heavy for me. It now existed between us. My husband started waking up earlier and going for walks. He would come back quiet, polite, distant. He didn't avoid me, but he didn't get close to me either. I didn't try to fill that space. For the first time in my life, I respected the other person's time even if it hurt me. The house looked the same. The furniture was in the same place. The habits remained. But something irrevocably different had happened. The truth now occupied space. Some nights, I would hear him sighing in the next room. Other nights, he would stay up late, sitting in the living room, staring into space. I knew that, in that silence, he was reliving an entire life, through a new lens, and I accepted that. Because that pain wasn't unfair. It was a consequence. Something strange began to happen to me. Along with the fear of losing everything, came a profound, almost embarrassing relief. I no longer needed to measure my words. I didn't need to hide my gaze. I didn't need to maintain a version of events. The burden that had carried me for almost half a century finally wasn't just mine. There were days when I felt empty. Others, when I finally felt whole. I understood then that liberation doesn't always come with joy. Sometimes it comes with grief. I grieve for a life that could have been different. I grieve for broken trust. I grieve for time that will never return. My husband didn't accuse me, but he didn't absolve me either. And that was perhaps the hardest part to accept. Because I learned that forgiveness is not an obligation. It's a process when it happens. A few weeks later, he sat down at the table with me one quiet afternoon. The coffee was getting cold in the cups. "I still don't know what I feel," he said. "But I know I need to relearn who we are, without lies." I agreed. I didn't ask for guarantees. I didn't ask for promises. "I understand," I replied, "and I accept whichever path you need to take." He looked at me for a long time. There was no tenderness, but there was no contempt either. "The truth didn't fix anything," he said, "but it stopped the lie from growing any longer." I felt a lump in my throat, because that was exactly it. Over time, small changes occurred. There was no quick reconciliation. There were no cinematic endings. There was honest coexistence. We learned to talk about simple things, to cook together in silence, to respect new boundaries, and above all, we learned that dignity also resides in truth even when it hurts. I don't know how this story will end. Maybe we'll stay together, maybe not. But I know one thing with absolute clarity. I will not die carrying a lie. For years, I thought that protecting others meant sacrificing myself in silence. Today, I understand that excessive silence is also a form of violence against oneself. The truth didn't save me from suffering, but it saved me from disappearing inside. And that, after 45 years, was already an immense liberation. I'm not a heroine, nor am I just a villain. I am a woman who made an impossible choice, and has lived far too long paying for it alone. Now, for the first time, life goes on without secrets. And even though it hurts, she remains clean. For many years, I believed that loving meant hiding, that protecting meant silencing, that being a good wife and a good mother meant carrying everything alone even when it ate me up inside. Today, after everything I've been through, I understand something that took me almost a lifetime to learn. There are truths that hurt when they are spoken, but there are lies that slowly rot every day. Silence may seem like a safe choice. It avoids conflict. It avoids ruptures. It avoids difficult looks. But it also prevents healing. It prevents growth. It prevents life from being complete. I didn't tell the truth expecting forgiveness. I told it because I could no longer bear to continue existing only halfway. I learned that there are no easy choices when we are afraid. There are only possible choices made with the emotional resources we have at that moment. Carrying guilt for decades doesn't change the past. It only robs us of the present. Perhaps you're listening to this story and thinking, I would never do that. Or perhaps you're thinking, I've done something similar, and I never told anyone. Whatever your situation may be, I want to tell you something honestly. No one lives in peace hiding who they are. The truth doesn't guarantee happy endings. It doesn't promise reconciliations. It doesn't erase consequences. But it gives back something essential, the chance to exist without masks. If there's something inside you that weighs you down too much, something you've pushed to the bottom out of fear, shame, or guilt, maybe it's not courage that's lacking. Perhaps it's just the right time, and it comes, sooner or later, for all of us. Before I go, I'll leave you with 2 questions not to answer aloud, but to take with you. Have you been carrying something heavy for too long? And how much of your life is being shaped by the fear of telling the truth? If this story touched you in any way, write in the comments. Like, share, and follow the channel. Here, we don't judge impossible choices. We listen to human stories, stories of those who made mistakes, loved, suffered, and still had the courage to stop hiding.